All right, let's dive deep into this brain stuff. You actually want a whole detailed summary of Chapter 2, huh? We're going to break down all the big theories and the concepts and the research and even those crazy case studies, all of it.
From like neurons to
Yeah,
neurotransmitters.
all those different parts of the brain and all that. We're covering everything. You can see just how much this stuff matters in your day-to-day life, really.
It's wild how much understanding this biology stuff, like, the biology of your mind can help explain things, like why you want to eat chocolate all the time or
Yeah.
how you actually make decisions, stuff like that.
Okay, so to get started, we have to start with, like, the most basic part of all of it, neurons.
The tiny messengers of your nervous system.
Yeah, so they're basically like the messengers for your nervous system, right?
Yeah, think of them like these super tiny electrical circuits, just like constantly buzzing, sending all these signals all through your body.
So they're just cells. But how do they even work?
So each neuron has these really specific parts, right? So first you got the dendrites. These are like the little branches reaching out, ready to pick up messages from other neurons.
Okay, I'm following.
And then you have the axon, this long fiber that actually sends the neuron's message out to other cells.
So it's like dendrites listen and axons talk.
Exactly. And to make sure that message travels fast and doesn't get lost, the axon is usually covered in this fatty coating called the myelin sheath,
I see.
which you can think of like insulation on like a wire.
Okay.
And so then how does the message actually travel down the axon? Well, it takes the form of an electrical impulse, and this is called an action potential. It's kind of like a wave, like moving down a rope.
Interesting, like a wave.
And here's the really cool part. A neuron, it either fires or it doesn't. There's no in between,
Oh, so it's all or nothing.
just like a light switch on or off.
Yeah.
But then how does that explain the difference between, a light touch and then like a slap in the face?
Yeah, right.
Well, that comes down to the frequency of the firing. So like a light touch might trigger a few neurons to fire slowly, while like a slap would activate a whole bunch of neurons firing really fast.
I see. So it's like the brain's reading some kind of code, and then based on the signal patterns, it understands how intense something is.
Exactly.
Okay, so these neurons are firing, but then there's this little gap between them, right?
The synapse.
It's called the synapse.
Yeah.
Yeah. So how do those messages get across that gap? Do they, like, jump?
No, they don't jump. They use neurotransmitters,
Oh, right.
which are these chemical messengers that carry the signal from one neuron to the next.
So like a relay race, they pass the baton.
Exactly. The electrical signal goes down the axon, passes the baton to the neurotransmitter, which carries it across the synapse to the next neuron.
I'm with you.
And these neurotransmitters are super important because they're involved in everything, from our mood to our memory to our movements and even how we feel pain.
Wait, so you're saying, like, chemicals are controlling my thoughts and my feelings?
In a way, yeah. Like take serotonin, for example. It's a neurotransmitter that's really important for mood regulation. And when people have low levels of serotonin, that's been linked to depression, which is why antidepressants actually work by increasing those serotonin levels.
Oh, wow. So what happens to those neurotransmitters after they've delivered their message? Do they just, like, stay there in the synapse?
No, they have a couple options. They can either be reabsorbed by the sending neuron in a process called reuptake,
Okay.
or they can be broken down by enzymes. And that whole process is really important because if that balance of neurotransmitters gets messed up, then it can cause all kinds of problems.
Like those disorders that you mentioned before.
Yeah, exactly. Parkinson's disease, depression. And that's actually where drugs come in because
Mm.
some drugs will actually mimic those neurotransmitters while others block them. And that can be really helpful for treating certain conditions.
So it's like a delicate balance.
Yeah, it's this constant dance to keep all these neurotransmitters balanced throughout your whole nervous system.
And speaking of the nervous system, let's zoom out a little bit. Talk about how all those neurons are organized within the body.
Think of your nervous system as like this giant communication network with your brain and spinal cord as the central hub, which we call the central nervous system or the CNS.
Okay.
And then the peripheral nervous system or PNS is kind of like all the wires that branch out from that hub connecting to all the different parts of your body.
Okay, that makes sense.
And the PNS has two main divisions. The somatic nervous system, which is responsible for your voluntary movements, like when you reach for your coffee cup.
Right.
And then the autonomic nervous system, which controls all the stuff you don't think about, your heartbeat, your digestion, all that.
That's a lot.
And then the autonomic nervous system is also divided into two branches. The sympathetic nervous system, which gets you going, and then the parasympathetic nervous system, which calms you back down.
So it's like a gas pedal and a brake.
Exactly.
So they're both working to keep your body in balance.
All the time.
Okay, so I'm starting to understand how this system works. But how do scientists even, like study something as complex as the brain. It's not like they can just crack it open and look inside.
Well, actually, they used to do that.
No way.
Yeah, early on, researchers relied on what they called lesion studies, where they'd look at what happened when different parts of the brain were damaged.
Wow.
But luckily, technology has gotten much better since then.
Yeah, so now we have all those cool brain imaging techniques, right? Like those fMRI images that show the brain lighting up when you're doing stuff.
Yeah, fMRI is one of the most exciting tools we have. It lets us actually see which areas of the brain are active when we're doing different tasks, and that gives us all kinds of insights into how the brain works.
It's like we can peek into people's minds.
It is. And then there's also the Human Connectome Project, which is this huge effort to map out all the different connections in the brain.
Oh yeah, it's like trying to map the entire internet, but inside our heads. Okay, so we've talked about neurons, the nervous system, and how scientists actually study the brain. But what about the brain itself?
Right.
Let's start with like the oldest part, the brainstem.
Okay.
What's going on down there?
So the brainstem is kind of like the basement of the brain.
The basement.
It's responsible for all those basic functions that keep us alive, things like breathing, our heartbeat, our sleep-wake cycles, that kind of thing.
Okay.
So it's the most primitive part of the brain, but it's super important.
So if it's like the basement, what are some of the key things down there?
So right at the base of the brainstem, you've got the medulla, and this controls your heartbeat and breathing. And if it's damaged, that's it, game over, even if the rest of the brain is fine.
Oh, wow.
Then just above the medulla is the pons, which helps coordinate movements and sleep.
Uh-huh.
And then a bit higher up is the reticular formation, which acts like a filter for all the sensory information coming in. And it basically decides what's important to send on up to the conscious part of the brain.
Oh, so that's how we can tune out all that background noise and focus on a conversation. Our reticular formation is doing its job.
Exactly. And then on top of the brainstem, you have the thalamus, which is like a sensory relay station. It routes all that information to the right parts of the brain.
So like a busy airport, sending all those flights to the right destinations.
Yeah, perfect analogy. And then just behind the brainstem, you have the cerebellum.
Ah, yes, the
Yeah.
cerebellum. That's the balance and coordination center, right?
Exactly. It's why you can walk and talk and even dance without falling over. It's also involved in some learning and memory, but more like the nonverbal stuff.
So if you're good at sports or playing music, you can thank your cerebellum.
You got it. So even though the brainstem and cerebellum are like the oldest parts of the brain, they're still crucial for just about everything we do.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing.
Yeah.
So we've explored the basement. Now let's go upstairs to the limbic system. This is where emotions and drives and memories hang out.
Right. It is. You can think of it as the emotional and memory center of your brain.
What are some of the key parts of this system?
Well, one of the most well-known is the amygdala, and this processes emotions, particularly fear and aggression.
Like that study where they removed the amygdala from those monkeys and they basically turned into these like mellow, fearless creatures.
Right. That study really showed how important the amygdala is for our emotional responses.
So fascinating. And what about the hypothalamus? That's involved in basic drives, right? Like hunger and thirst.
Exactly. The hypothalamus is like the brain's thermostat. It regulates body temperature, hunger, thirst, sleep-wake cycles. It also controls the endocrine system, which releases hormones that control everything from growth and development to stress and sex drive.
Wow, it does a lot. Didn't researchers discover a pleasure center in the brain somewhere around there too?
They did. It was totally an accident, too. They were studying rats, and they found this area in the hypothalamus that when they stimulated it, it seemed to produce these really intense feelings of pleasure.
So that's where the idea of a reward system came from.
It is. And now we know that this reward system plays a role in everything from motivation and addiction to love and social bonding.
That's crazy. So we've got the amygdala handling fear and aggression, the hypothalamus regulating all those bodily functions and pleasure. What else is in the limbic system?
The hippocampus, which is super important for forming new memories.
So if it's damaged, you can't make new memories.
You got it. It's like having a camera. You can take pictures, but you can't save them to your memory card.
I see.
Very frustrating.
Yeah, it would be.
Yeah, so the limbic system is pretty important. It's like where our core personality and experiences are shaped.
It's like the bridge between our basic instincts and our higher thinking.
Exactly.
Speaking of higher thinking, let's talk about the most evolved part of the brain, the cerebral cortex.
Right.
What makes this part so special?
It's like the CEO of the brain, you know? It's the wrinkled outer layer responsible for all those higher level functions like language, reasoning, problem solving, decision making, all that good stuff.
This is what separates us from,
Yeah.
like, other animals, right?
Right. For the most part, yeah. The human cerebral cortex is much bigger and more complex than in any other animal, and it's divided into 4 lobes.
Why lobes?
Each with its own special functions.
Okay, I'm ready for a lobe tour.
Okay, first up is the frontal lobes, right behind your forehead. They're involved in planning, organization, impulse control, judgment, all that.
So the frontal lobes are like the adult in the room, keeping everything in check.
You could say that. And within the frontal lobes, you have the prefrontal cortex, which is basically the executive control center.
So the prefrontal cortex is where all the big decisions are made.
Exactly. It's involved in planning for the future, weighing different options, making those complex decisions. It's also the last part of the brain to fully develop, which explains why teenagers can be so impulsive.
That makes a lot of sense.
It does.
So those are the frontal lobes? What about the other lobes?
Right next door, you have the parietal lobes, and those are involved in processing sensory information from your body, like touch, temperature, pain.
So if I touch something hot, the parietal lobes tell me to pull my hand away.
Exactly. They also help us with spatial awareness, understanding where our body is in space.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
And what about the occipital lobes? Those are in the back of the head, right?
Yep. And as you might guess, they're all about vision. They receive input from your eyes and process it to create those images that we see.
So if I'm looking at a beautiful sunset, it's thanks to the occipital lobes.
It is. And finally, we have the temporal lobes, which are just above your ears, and they handle auditory information, language comprehension, and memory.
So if I'm listening to my favorite song, the temporal lobes are jamming out.
Exactly. They also play a role in recognizing faces and objects.
Wow, that's a lot of work for one lobe.
Yeah.
So we have these 4 lobes, each doing their own thing, but they all work together to create our thoughts and feelings and behaviors. It's incredible how it all comes together.
It is. And within each lobe, you have specific areas responsible for even more specific functions. Like in the frontal lobes, there's the motor cortex, which controls voluntary movements. So if you want to raise your hand, your motor cortex sends the signal to your muscles.
And then right next to the motor cortex, there's the somatosensory cortex, which receives sensory information from the body.
Exactly. So those 2 areas work together, they control movement, and they receive feedback from the body.
Oh, wow. So then what about the association areas? I remember reading something about those.
Oh, yeah. Those are spread throughout the entire cortex, and they're involved in those higher level mental functions, things like thinking, planning, language.
So that's where all the magic happens.
You could say that. It's what allows us to understand the world, to learn and remember, and to even come up with new ideas.
That's incredible. But what happens if the brain gets damaged? Is it like a lost cause?
Not at all. The brain is incredibly good at changing and adapting.
Really?
We call this plasticity.
So even after something like a stroke, brain can actually rewire itself to get back those functions that it lost.
Exactly. And the more we learn, the more we're figuring out how to use the brain's plasticity to help people recover from those injuries, and even to improve how our brains work in general.
So it's like the brain is a muscle.
Yeah. The more we use it and challenge it, the stronger it gets. And one of the most exciting discoveries lately is that the brain can even make new neurons throughout our lives.
Wait a second. I thought we were born with all the brain cells we'd ever have.
Nope, that's what we thought for a long time. But now we know that new neurons are being born all the time, especially in this area called the hippocampus.
The hippocampus?
Yeah, it's involved in learning and memory.
Interesting. So it's like our brains are constantly renewing themselves.
They are. And things like exercise, good sleep, and having a stimulating environment can actually make that process happen even more.
So staying active, both physically and mentally, is really important for our brains.
You got it. And that brings us to one of the most interesting areas of brain research, what we call the divided brain. What happens when those 2 halves of the brain aren't able to talk to each other anymore?
Ooh, now that is a question that I definitely want to explore more.
Yeah, it's fascinating stuff.
I mean, it is.
And we'll dig into the whole world of split brain research next time and what it tells us about those 2 hemispheres.
Sounds good. I can't wait.
Yeah, it's really cool stuff.
Awesome. So before we got sidetracked, we were just about to dive into the whole world of split brains. It's kind of creepy, right? Like, could we actually have 2 minds living in one head?
It's definitely a question that's messed with philosophers and scientists forever, but thankfully, because of some really groundbreaking research, we're actually getting closer to understanding the mysteries of the divided brain.
And it all started with a pretty intense surgery.
It did. Back in the 1960s, surgeons started doing this procedure called a corpus callosotomy to help people with really severe epilepsy. And it basically involved cutting the corpus callosum, which is this thick band of nerve fibers that connects the two halves of your brain.
So they basically cut the communication lines between the two sides of the brain. What happened to those patients? Did they, like, turn into Jekyll and Hyde?
Actually, no, not really. In their normal day-to-day lives, these split-brain patients seemed totally normal. But when researchers started doing some pretty clever experiments, they found some really interesting differences in how the two halves of their brains were working.
Like, what kind of experiments did they, like, show different pictures to each eye or something?
Yeah, that's exactly what they did. They used the fact that information from your left visual field goes to your right hemisphere and vice versa. So they could show a picture to one half of the brain without the other half even knowing about it.
That's so sneaky. So what did they learn?
Well, one of the most famous experiments was when they showed a picture of a spoon to the right hemisphere of a split brain patient. And then they asked the patient to name the object.
And could they do it?
Nope. The patient couldn't say what they were seeing. And that's because the left hemisphere, which is usually the one that handles language, had no clue what the right hemisphere was looking at.
So the right hemisphere knew it was a spoon, but it couldn't tell the left hemisphere.
Exactly. But here's the crazy part. When they asked the patient to reach behind a screen with their left hand, which is controlled by the right hemisphere, and pick out the object they had seen, they could do it, no problem.
Wait, so their left hand knew it was a spoon even though they couldn't say it?
Exactly. That showed that both sides of the brain could process information and act on it completely separately from each other.
So it really is like having two separate brains working at the same time.
In a way, yeah. And this led to a ton of research that showed us some fascinating things about what each half of the brain is best at.
So is it really true that the left brain is logical and the right brain is creative?
Well, it's not quite that simple, but in general, the research says that the left hemisphere is usually the one in charge of language, logic, and analytical thinking. It's like the detail-oriented scientist who likes to break things down into their smallest parts.
And the right hemisphere is like the big picture artist.
Yeah, you could say that. The right hemisphere is really good at spatial reasoning, recognizing faces, processing emotions, and understanding the whole context of a situation.
So they both have their strengths. But in a normal brain, where the corpus callosum is still intact, they're talking to each other and working together all the time, right?
Absolutely. It's an amazing partnership, each half bringing its own unique abilities to the table to create one unified experience.
But in these split brain patients, that connection is broken. So it's like they each have their own thing going on.
Yeah, and it can lead to some pretty weird and sometimes funny situations.
Like that one about this split brain patient who was getting dressed, and one hand was buttoning his shirt while the other hand was unbuttoning it.
That's a classic example. It seems like the two halves of his brain just couldn't agree on whether he wanted to be dressed or not.
It's so hard to wrap your head around, Like, how can someone have two separate streams of consciousness going on at the same time?
It really challenges how we think about what it means to be one person. And there's still so much we don't know about how consciousness works. But this split brain research has given us some really interesting clues.
It's amazing that these patients who were going through this major surgery ended up teaching us so much about how the brain works.
Yeah, it really shows the power of curiosity and how resilient humans can be.
So we've seen how split brain research has shown us the unique skills of each half of the brain. But for those of us with regular brains, do we experience this hemispheric specialization too?
Yeah, to a certain extent. While we don't have this dramatic separation between our hemispheres, studies have shown that some activities tend to use one side of the brain more than the other. Like when you're talking or solving a math problem, there's more activity on the left side.
So the left brain is still the language and logic center for most people.
Generally, yeah. But it's important to remember that both sides are always working together. The right hemisphere isn't just sitting there doing nothing. It's super active in things that need spatial skills, understanding emotions, and enjoying music and art.
So it's still a team effort, even though each side has its specialties.
Exactly. And even if we don't realize it, this constant back and forth between the two hemispheres is a big part of what makes us who we are.
It's amazing to think about this complex dance happening in our heads all the time.
It is. And it's just one example of how incredibly adaptable our brains are. Speaking of which, let's talk about brain plasticity. You mentioned earlier that even after a stroke, the brain can rewire itself. How does that actually work?
Yeah, I was wondering about that. Do new neurons just magically appear to replace the damaged ones?
It's not quite that simple. But the brain is really good at reorganizing itself after an injury. Like, if one part of the brain gets damaged, other parts can sometimes step in and take over those functions.
So it's like rerouting traffic when there's a road closure.
Perfect analogy. And this rewiring can happen in a few different ways, like by strengthening existing connections, forming new ones, and even changing what the existing neurons do.
So it's not just about making new neurons, it's about using the ones we have in the best way possible.
Exactly. And we can actually see this happening in therapies like constraint-induced movement therapy, where stroke patients are encouraged to use their weaker limb, and as their brain rewires itself, they start to regain function.
So their brain is learning to compensate for the damage.
Exactly. And this ability to adapt isn't limited to recovering from injuries. Our brains are always changing based on what we experience.
So every time we learn something new, our brains are actually changing their physical structure.
That's right. It's like our brain is a sculptor, constantly molding and reshaping itself based on what we do and what we experience.
That's incredible. So the more we challenge our brains, the more we're actually changing them for the better.
You got it. And this has huge implications for things like education and rehab, but also for how we age and our overall well-being.
So things like learning a new language, picking up a new hobby, or even just having interesting conversations can actually change our brains.
That's right. And that's why it's so important to keep our minds engaged throughout our lives.
It's kind of empowering to think about, like we're not stuck with the brains we were born with. We can actually shape them through our experiences.
Exactly. And that leads us to one of the most exciting discoveries in neuroscience, which is neurogenesis, the formation of new brain cells.
We touched on this earlier, but it's still wild to think that this is even possible. Like for so long, we were told that we're stuck with the brain cells we're born with.
I know, right? That was a common belief for years. But thanks to some amazing research, now we know that new neurons are made throughout our lives, especially in this area called the hippocampus.
And that's involved with learning and memory, right? So does this mean we can actually grow our brains just by learning new things?
It's not quite that direct, but research does show that certain things can encourage neurogenesis, like exercise, getting enough sleep, and being in stimulating environments.
So if I go to the gym, get a good night's sleep, and then spend the day exploring a new city, I'm basically giving my brain a boost.
Yeah, kind of. Of course, it's more complicated than that, but the main point is that we have more control over how healthy our brains are than we used to think.
It's also fascinating. But what about those mind-blowing things we were talking about before?
Yeah.
Like, could we train our brains to see the world in totally new ways, to experience emotions that we haven't even thought of yet?
Those are some big questions. And while we don't have all the answers yet, there's some super interesting research happening that's exploring those very possibilities.
Like that sensory substitution stuff where blind people can see using touch.
Exactly. And there are other researchers who are trying to figure out how to make our senses even better, to create brand new senses, and even to tap into parts of our consciousness that we can't even imagine right now.
It's starting to sound like something out of a sci-fi movie.
It kind of is. But the more we learn about how adaptable our brains are, the less clear that line between science fiction and reality becomes.
This has been an amazing journey. We've learned so much, from how neurons work to the complex functions of the cerebral cortex and the crazy world of split brains and neurogenesis. But before we finish this deep dive, I have one last question. If our brains are always changing, does that mean who we are is always changing too?
That's a really thought-provoking question, and one that we'll definitely dive into in our last segment.
All right, so we've been on this incredible journey through the brain, and now we're at this big question. If our brains are always changing, does that mean, like, who we are is always changing too?
Yeah, it really gets to the core of what identity even is. Like think about it. Every experience you have, every book you read, every conversation, it all leaves this little mark on your brain.
It's like we're collecting these little brain souvenirs, and they all kind of add up to who we become.
Exactly. And as we get more and more of these experiences, those connections in our brains are always getting stronger or weaker or even like totally rerouted. It never really stops changing.
That's kind of cool, but also kind of scary. I mean, if who we are is always changing, does that mean there's no such thing as a, stable self?
Well, that's something philosophers have been arguing about forever. But from what we know about the brain, it seems like the self is more like a river that's always flowing, not like a solid rock.
Okay, so, there's continuity, but the water is always changing.
Right. There's this core essence that stays the same, but it's always being shaped by all those experiences.
So then what does that mean for how we think about things like personality and free will? Like, if our brains are so flexible, are we even really in control of who we are or what we do?
Now, those are some really deep questions, and there aren't any easy answers. But I think understanding how changeable our brains are can give us a new perspective on these big questions, you know?
So we're not just these fixed, unchanging beings. We're actually always evolving and becoming something new.
Exactly. And that can be really freeing and empowering. It means we're not limited by, whatever we were born with. We can actually shape how we develop.
We're all works in progress.
We are. And that's a beautiful thing. It means we always have the potential to grow, to learn, to become better versions of ourselves throughout our lives.
I love that. But if we're always changing, could we eventually become totally different people than who we are today?
It's possible. Think about those huge changes people go through when they, say, beat an addiction or find a new spiritual path, or even just commit to getting in shape.
So it's like we have all these different selves inside us just waiting to be discovered.
Maybe. And I think the key to unlocking that potential is understanding how powerful and flexible our brains really are.
That reminds me of those mind-blowing possibilities we were talking about before, like sensory substitution and creating new senses.
Mm.
Could we really train our brains to experience the world in completely different ways?
That research is still pretty new, but the potential is huge. Imagine being able to see magnetic fields, to hear colors, or even feel other people's emotions.
That would be incredible. How would that even work?
It all comes down to the brain's ability to adapt and rewire itself. For example, with those sensory substitution devices, researchers are basically figuring out how to hack the brain's sensory systems and redirect information from one sense to another.
Like that device that turns visual information into sounds so blind people can hear what's around them?
Exactly. And the amazing thing is that over time, the brain actually learns how to understand these new patterns and creates a sensory experience that was never there before.
So it's like teaching the brain a whole new language for our senses.
Exactly. And it's not just for vision. There are devices that turn touch into sounds, which lets people with paralysis feel things through sound.
That's unbelievable. It opens up so many possibilities. But could we take this even further? Could we make entirely new senses that don't even exist in nature?
That's what researchers are trying to figure out. Some scientists are even working on devices that would let us sense magnetic fields or radio waves.
That would be like having superpowers.
Yeah.
But what about emotions? Can we train our brains to feel emotions we've never felt before?
That's a lot more complicated. Emotions involve a bunch of different parts of the brain, but some researchers think we might be able to change our emotional experiences using things like brain stimulation or neurofeedback.
So we could turn our emotions up or down. That seems a little risky.
There are definitely some ethical concerns that we have to think about carefully, but it could also lead to new ways to treat things like depression, anxiety, and even PTSD.
It's amazing to think that we might be able to use our brains to heal ourselves and even improve our emotional health.
It is. It's just one example of the huge potential that's hidden inside this amazing organ we call the brain.
This whole deep dive has been such an eye-opener. We've explored so much, from the tiny parts of neurons to the huge possibilities of the cerebral cortex and the mind-blowing stuff about split brains and neurogenesis, and I feel like we've barely scratched the surface.
I know, right? There's so much more to learn, and as we keep exploring the brain, we're going to discover even more incredible things.
This has been an amazing journey, and thank you so much for guiding us through this amazing world of the brain.
It's been my pleasure.
And to all of you listening, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the biology of your mind. We hope you've learned something new, and that you're a little more amazed by the power and potential that's inside your own brain. Remember, you're a work in progress, a masterpiece that's always being created. So keep learning, keep those synapses firing, and never stop exploring the wonders of your own mind. Until next time, keep those brains buzzing.